The late afternoon sun beat down on Red Hollow like a hammer on an anvil, turning the main street into a shimmering river of dust and desperation. Clara Whitmore stood in that suffocating heat, her wrists bound with rough hemp that had already rubbed her skin raw, and tried to remember what it felt like to be human. 3 months ago, she'd been a schoolteacher. She'd had a classroom with 14 students, a small room above the general store, and a future that, while modest, had belonged to her. She'd taught children their letters, helped them sound out words from Warren McGuffey readers, and believed, foolishly she now understood, that civilization had finally reached even this godforsaken corner of the frontier. Then the fever came. It swept through Red Hollow like wildfire through dead grass, taking the young and old first, then anyone whose body couldn't fight back. Clara had nursed the sick, held the hands of dying children, and watched the town's population cut in half over 6 terrible weeks. When the fever finally burned itself out, Red Hollow was left with too many graves, too few women, and men whose desperation had curdled into something darker. That's when Mayor Hutchins called the town meeting. Clara had attended, thinking they'd discuss rebuilding, perhaps sending for aid from Fort Carson. Instead, Hutchins had stood on the church steps. The irony wasn't lost on her, and proposed what he called a practical solution to our demographic crisis: the bride lottery. Any unmarried woman in Red Hollow would be offered to the highest bidder. The money raised would go toward the town's recovery. The women would get husbands, protection, a place in the new order. Hutchins had made it sound almost reasonable, his voice smooth as snake oil, while the men in the crowd nodded and the few women present looked at the ground. Clara had been the only one to stand up and object. "This is slavery," she'd said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "You're talking about selling human beings." Hutchins had smiled at her then, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Whitmore, you're educated, I'll grant you that, but education doesn't put food on the table or rebuild what the fever destroyed. This is survival. You can participate willingly, or we can make other arrangements." The other arrangements had involved being dragged from her room 2 nights later, her few possessions seized to pay fabricated debts, and thrown into the makeshift holding pen behind the saloon with 11 other women. Now, standing in that line with the sun beating down and the crowd gathering, Clara understood with perfect clarity that Red Hollow hadn't been civilized at all. It had simply been pretending, and the fever had burned away the pretense. "Gentlemen!" Mayor Hutchins' voice boomed across the square. He'd positioned himself on a wooden platform, dressed in his Sunday best, playing master of ceremonies to hell itself. "Thank you for your patience. Today marks a new beginning for Red Hollow. Today, we rebuild not just our buildings, but our families, our future." A cheer went up from the assembled men. Clara counted maybe 40 of them, ranging from grizzled prospectors to young ranch hands barely old enough to shave. Some looked uncomfortable, their eyes downcast. Others stared at the line of women with naked hunger that made Clara's stomach turn. "Now, we'll proceed in an orderly fashion," Hutchins continued. "Each lady will step forward, and bidding will commence at $50. Payment in gold, silver, or promissory notes backed by property deed. No credit, no exceptions." He gestured to the first woman in line, Sarah Brennan, a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident 2 years back. She was 43, worn down by hardship, and she walked to the platform like a woman climbing gallows steps. "What am I bid for Mrs. Brennan?" Hutchins called out. "A fine woman, experienced in household management, strong constitution." The bidding was brief and brutal. A prospector named Dutch Henderson won her for $75. Sarah's face remained blank as Henderson stepped forward to claim her, but Clara saw her hands shaking. One by one, the women were called forward. One by one, they were bought. Martha Green, 22 and pretty despite the haunted look in her eyes, went for $120 to a rancher named Cobb, who already had a reputation for a mean temper and quick fists. Elizabeth Porter, just 17, went for $90 to a man 3 times her age. The sun crept lower. The dust swirled. The crowd's energy built with each transaction, voices getting louder, bids getting bolder. Clara watched it all with a kind of detached horror, her mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. Then Hutchins called her name. "Miss Clara Whitmore!" His voice carried false cheer. Formerly our school teacher, 26 years old, educated, literate, can read and write, do figures. A prize, gentlemen, a true prize. Claire's legs didn't want to move. For a moment, she thought about simply refusing, about making them drag her up to that platform. But what would be the point? They'd just hurt her, humiliate her further, and the outcome would be the same. She walked forward, her head high despite everything. If they were going to strip away her dignity, she wouldn't help them do it. The platform boards creaked under her feet. From up here, she could see the entire crowd. A sea of faces, some apologetic, some eager, all complicit. She searched for allies and found none. Even Reverend Matthews, who'd praised her teaching, wouldn't meet her eyes. "What am I bid?" Hutchins called out. 100, someone shouted immediately. 125. 150. The bids came fast, faster than for any of the previous women. Clara felt sick. The education they'd once valued now made her a commodity, a trophy to be won. 200. That was Jack Sullivan, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He was 56, had buried 2 wives already, and Clara had seen how he looked at her in church. 225. A younger voice. Tom Brenner, son of the man who owned the mine. The bidding climbed. Clara stood there, frozen, while men shouted numbers that reduced her entire existence to currency. She thought about jumping off the platform, running, but where would she go? The desert stretched for miles in every direction, and she had no horse, no supplies, no allies. $300, Sullivan again, his voice booming with confidence. And that's my final offer. Silence fell. $300 was more than most men in Red Hollow made in a year. The crowd murmured, impressed and envious in equal measure. Hutchins raised his gavel. $300 to Mr. Sullivan, going once. 500. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, quiet but cutting through the noise like a knife through silk. Every head turned, Clara's breath caught. The man who stepped forward didn't belong in Red Hollow. That was the first thing she noticed. He moved with a predator's grace, his footsteps silent despite his boots, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing trail-worn leather and dark cotton that had seen hard use. His hair was long and black, tied back with a strip of rawhide, and his skin was the deep bronze of someone who'd spent their entire life under the sun. But it was his face that made the crowd step back. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that looked carved from stone, and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, old and white against his skin. He was Apache. That was obvious from his features, his bearing, the way he moved. And in Red Hollow, where Apache raids were still fresh in living memory, that made him something between a ghost and a devil. "Did you say 500? Hutchins' voice had lost some of its bluster. The man, Clara would later learn his name was Ronan Vale, though even that wouldn't be his real name, just the one he'd taken when he needed to move in the white world, simply nodded. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, which he tossed onto the platform with a heavy clink. Hutchins picked it up with trembling hands and opened it. Gold coins spilled into his palm, glinting in the fading sunlight. "I'll be damned," someone in the crowd muttered. Sullivan pushed forward, his face red. "Now wait just a minute. You can't just..." "Can't just what?" Ronan's voice was quiet, but it carried threat like a loaded gun. "Follow your rules? Pay your price?" "You're not from here," Sullivan blustered. "You're..." "Apache?" Ronan finished. "Is that against the rules? Did Mayor Hutchins specify whites only when he announced this auction?" He said the last word with enough contempt to make several men flinch. Hutchins cleared his throat, clearly doing rapid calculations. $500 was $500, and the town needed every penny. "Now, gentlemen, the rules were clear. Highest bidder wins. And Mr. Vale," Ronan said, "Mr. Vale here has offered $500 in gold. Unless someone wants to bid higher?" Sullivan looked like he wanted to argue further, but he wasn't stupid. Going higher would bankrupt him, and besides, there was something about the way Ronan stood, perfectly still, perfectly balanced, that suggested violence wasn't far beneath the surface. The silence stretched. Clara found herself staring at this stranger who'd just bought her, trying to understand what she was seeing. His expression gave nothing away. He wasn't leering like the other men had. He wasn't smiling with triumph. He simply waited, patient as stone. "Going once," Hutchins said nervously. "Going twice." He paused, perhaps hoping someone would save him from this uncomfortable situation. When no one spoke, he brought the gavel down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Sold to Mr. Vale for $500. Ronan stepped onto the platform. Up close, he was even more imposing, not just his height, but the contained power in his movements, like a coiled spring. He looked at Clara for the first time, really looked at her, and she couldn't read what she saw in those dark eyes. "Your hands," he said quietly. Clara glanced down at her bound wrists, then back at him, confused. Without waiting for permission, Ronan drew a knife from his belt, a wicked-looking thing with a bone handle, and several men in the crowd tensed. But he simply reached out, held Clara's wrist steady with one hand, and sliced through the rope with a single economical motion. The hemp fell away. Clara's hands were free for the first time in 3 days. "You can walk?" Ronan asked. It took Clara a moment to find her voice. "Yes." "Then let's go." He turned and stepped off the platform, clearly expecting her to follow. Clara stood there, her mind reeling, trying to process what had just happened. Behind her, Hutchins was already calling forward the next woman, eager to continue the proceedings now that the uncomfortable moment had passed. Clara looked out of the crowd, at Sullivan's angry face, at Hutchins' greedy expression, at all the men who'd bid on her like she was livestock. Then she looked at Ronan's back as he walked away, at the way the crowd parted for him without him asking. She'd just been sold. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow. She was property now, owned by a stranger, an Apache warrior who'd paid $500 in gold for reasons she couldn't begin to fathom. But her hands were free. Clara climbed down from the platform and followed him. Ronan's horse was tied up outside the saloon, a big roan stallion with intelligent eyes and a wild look that suggested it had never been fully broken. Next to it stood a gray mare, already saddled and provisioned. "She's yours," Ronan said, nodding at the mare. "Can you ride?" Clara nodded. "Yes. I grew up on a farm in Missouri before I came here to teach." "Good." He began checking the mare's saddle straps, his movements efficient and practiced. "We leave now. If you need anything from wherever you were living, speak up. We won't come back." "I have nothing," Clara said, and it was true. Everything she'd owned had been taken when they'd arrested her on those false debt charges. "They took it all." Ronan glanced at her, something flickering across his face. Anger, maybe, or disgust. "Then we ride." He swung up onto his horse with easy grace. Clara approached the mare more cautiously. It had been years since she'd ridden, and her hands were shaking with a combination of fear, exhaustion, and shock. But the mare stood steady, and Clara managed to get her foot in the stirrup and pull herself up. The moment she was seated, Ronan turned his horse and started down the main street at a walk. Clara followed, very aware of the eyes on them, the entire town watching as the Apache warrior rode out with his purchased bride. They passed the general store where Clara had lived above. They passed the church where she'd taught Sunday school to children who now probably didn't remember her name. They passed the cemetery on the edge of town, where fresh graves still showed disturbed earth from the fever victims. Not one person called out to her. Not one person said goodbye. As they reached the edge of Red Hollow, where the buildings gave way to scrub brush and desert, Clara looked back one last time. The town sat there in the failing light, looking small and mean and temporary, like it might blow away in the next strong wind. She hoped it would. Then Ronan spurred his horse to a trot, and they left Red Hollow behind. They rode east as the sun set, heading into the broken country where the high desert gave way to canyon lands. Ronan set a steady pace, not too fast but relentless, and Clara focused all her energy on staying in the saddle and keeping up. She had 1,000 questions screaming in her mind. Why had he bought her? Where were they going? What did he want from her? But every time she opened her mouth to ask, the questions died on her lips. There was something about Ronan's silence, about the way he rode with his attention on the horizon and his hand never far from the rifle strapped to his saddle, that suggested this wasn't the time for conversation. Besides, Clara was discovering that 3 days in a holding pen with minimal food and water had left her weaker than she'd realized. Her legs ached from gripping the saddle. Her head spun with exhaustion. It took all her concentration just to keep moving forward. The landscape changed as they rode. The flat scrubland gave way to rolling hills, then to the first rocky outcroppings that marked the beginning of the canyon country. The sun disappeared behind the western mountains, and the temperature dropped sharply. Clara shivered in her thin dress, the same one she'd been wearing when they arrested her, now stained and torn. Just when Clara thought she might actually fall from her horse, Ronan slowed and stopped in a small depression between two hills. There was a cluster of juniper trees here, offering minimal shelter, and the remains of an old campfire. "We stop here," Ronan said, dismounting. "Water the horses first." Clara slid off the mare, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit the ground. She had to grab the saddle to keep from falling. Ronan noticed but didn't comment, simply led his own horse to a small seep spring Clara hadn't even seen in the growing darkness. By the time Clara got her mare watered, the animal drank eagerly, making Clara realize guiltily that she should have thought of that sooner. Ronan had already gathered wood and started a small fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, making him look even more intimidating. He pulled supplies from his saddlebags with practiced efficiency: dried meat, hardtack, a canteen. He tossed Clara a piece of jerky and the canteen. "Eat, drink, sleep when you're done." Clara caught them awkwardly. "I thank you." He didn't respond, just went back to tending the fire. Clara sat on a flat rock near the flames, suddenly ravenous. The jerky was tough and salty, but it was the first real food she'd had in days. She ate it slowly, washing it down with careful sips from the canteen, very aware that she didn't know where the next water was coming from. Across the fire, Ronan sat with his back against a boulder, his rifle across his knees, his eyes on the darkness beyond their small circle of light. He ate sparingly, mechanically, like a man who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure. Clara watched him over the flames. Now that the shock was beginning to wear off, fear was settling in its place. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she didn't know, a man who'd bought her, a man who could do anything he wanted to her and no one would ever know. Her hand crept to her pocket, where she'd managed to hide a small folding knife back in the holding pen. It wasn't much, the blade was only 2 inches long, but it was something. If he tried to— "You're wondering what I'm going to do to you," Ronan said suddenly, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. Clara's hand froze. "Is this—" "The answer is nothing." He still wasn't looking at her, his gaze on the darkness. "I bought you to get you away from that town, that's all." "I don't understand." "You don't have to. You paid $500. The money doesn't matter." "It matters to me." Clara's voice came out louder than she intended, sharpened by fear and exhaustion. "You bought me like I was a horse or a piece of furniture, and now you won't even tell me why? Won't tell me where we're going? Won't—" "I'm taking you to the canyon country," Ronan interrupted, his voice still maddeningly calm. "There's a place there, hidden. You'll be safe there until you figure out what you want to do next." Clara stared at him. "You're helping me? If that's what you want to call it. But why? You don't know me. You're not just anything." Now Ronan did look at her, and the intensity in his dark eyes made Clara's breath catch. What happened in that town was wrong. Evil. Someone needed to stop it. "So you stopped it by buying me?" "I stopped it by getting you out." He paused. "The others, I couldn't help them. Too many men, too many guns. But I could help one." Something in his voice, a note of old pain, old failure, made Clara's anger falter. She studied him across the fire, seeing him properly for the first time. The scar on his face looked like it had been made by a knife or maybe a claw. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of hard work and harder living. He wore no jewelry, carried nothing decorative. Everything about him was functional, stripped down to essentials. This was a man who'd been to hell and come back carrying the scars. "Why me?" Clara asked quietly. Ronan was silent for a long moment. "You were the only one who fought back," he said finally. "In the town meeting, I heard about it. You stood up and called it what it was, even knowing what it would cost you. A lot of good that did. More good than you know." He stood, moving with that same fluid grace. "Get some sleep. We ride at dawn, and tomorrow will be harder than today." He moved away from the fire, settling himself against another rock where he could watch both the fire and the approaches to their camp. Clara realized he intended to stay up all night, keeping watch. "Aren't you going to sleep?" she asked. "Later." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to demand more answers, wanted to scream at the unfairness of everything that had happened. But exhaustion was dragging at her like weights tied to her limbs. She lay down on the hard ground, using her arm as a pillow, and stared up at the emerging stars. She'd been sold today. Bought. By an Apache warrior who claimed he just wanted to help her but wouldn't explain why. She was heading into canyon country, into wilderness she'd never seen, with no guarantee of safety or future or anything beyond the promise of a man she'd known for less than 6 hours. She should be terrified, but as Clara's eyes drifted closed, the last thing she felt was the warmth of the fire, the fullness in her belly from the first real meal in days, and the sight of Ronan Vale's silhouette against the stars, standing watch. For the first time in 3 months, she felt almost safe. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sharp cold of desert dawn. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory crashed back like a fist to the chest. The auction, the ride. Ronan Vale standing silhouette against the stars. She sat up quickly, her body protesting every movement. Muscles she'd forgotten she had screamed in agony. Her back felt like someone had beaten it with a board, and her thighs burned from hours of gripping the saddle. "You'll hurt worse tomorrow," Ronan said without looking at her. He was crouched by the fire, pouring something dark and steaming into 2 tin cups. "Day after that, you'll start to toughen up." Clara wanted to snap at him, to tell him she wasn't some delicate flower who couldn't handle hardship, but the truth was she could barely stand. She pushed herself to her feet anyway, refusing to show weakness, and immediately had to grab a tree branch to keep from falling. Ronan glanced over, and she thought she saw the ghost of something, amusement, maybe, flicker across his face before it went neutral again. He held out one of the cups. "Coffee. It's terrible, but it's hot." Clara took it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warmth. The first sip made her wince. He hadn't been lying about it being terrible, but the bitter heat cut through the morning fog in her head. "We need to move," Ronan said, already kicking dirt over the fire. "Men from Red Hollow will follow. Maybe not today, but soon." That made Clara pause mid-sip. "Follow? Why would they?" Sullivan isn't the type to let go of something he wants. Neither is the mayor. Ronan began strapping supplies back onto his saddle with efficient movements. "They'll tell themselves they're coming to rescue you from the savage Apache. They'll gather guns and horses and righteous anger, and they'll come." "But you paid. You think money matters to men like that?" Ronan's voice hardened. "I embarrassed them, made them look weak in front of the whole town. Men like Sullivan don't forgive that." Clara absorbed this, her stomach sinking. "So we're running. We're staying ahead." He turned to face her fully. "There's a difference. Running is when you're scared and desperate and making mistakes. Staying ahead means you know the land, you know your enemy, and you use both to survive." "And you know the land?" Something flickered in Ronan's eyes, pain or memory, or both. "Better than anyone alive." Within 20 minutes, they were moving again. Clara's body fought her with every step, every movement of getting back on that horse a small agony, but she gritted her teeth and did it anyway, determined not to slow them down, not to be the weakness that got them caught. The terrain grew rougher as they rode deeper into the canyon country. The rolling hills gave way to steep-sided arroyos and towering rock formations that looked like the bones of some ancient, sleeping giants. The sky above was a hard, cloudless blue that seemed to press down on them with physical weight, and the sun climbed steadily, turning the landscape into a furnace. Ronan led them through a maze of washes and canyons, never seeming to hesitate, always knowing which turning to take. They rode single file, Clara following his tracks, and she realized with growing unease that if she lost sight of him in this terrain, she'd be hopelessly lost within minutes. "How do you know where you're going?" she called out during a brief rest in the shade of an overhanging cliff. Ronan was scanning the horizon, his eyes constantly moving. "I lived here. Before." "Before what?" He didn't answer, just remounted and moved on. Clara was learning that Ronan measured his words like a miser counting coins, giving away nothing that wasn't absolutely necessary. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of hooves on rock and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Clara found her mind wandering, trying to piece together the puzzle of the man leading her deeper into the wilderness. He was Apache. That much was obvious. But he spoke English without an accent, wore white man's clothes, and carried gold coins. He knew this land intimately, but moved through it like a ghost, leaving barely a trace. And he'd paid $500 to buy a white woman from an auction, claiming he just wanted to help. Nothing about it made sense. "There's water ahead," Ronan said suddenly, breaking hours of silence. "We'll stop there, let the horses rest." "How much farther to this hidden place you mentioned?" 3 days? Maybe 4, depending on how fast you adapt. Clara bristled. "I'm keeping up fine." "You're staying in the saddle. That's not the same as keeping up." He glanced back at her, and this time she definitely saw amusement. "You ride like someone who learned on a farm and hasn't done it in years. Your posture's wrong, you're gripping too tight, and you're fighting the horse instead of working with her." "I don't need a riding lesson from an Apache," Ronan finished, his voice carefully neutral. Clara felt her face flush. "That's not what I was going to say. Wasn't it?" They stared at each other across the distance between their horses. Clara wanted to protest, to insist she didn't judge him for his heritage. But would that be true? She'd grown up hearing stories about Apache raiders, about burned homesteads and slaughtered families. Fear and prejudice had been woven into the fabric of frontier life, and pretending she was immune to it would be a lie. "I don't know what I was going to say," Clara admitted finally. "But you're right. I'm a terrible rider. If you can teach me to be better, I'd be grateful for the lesson." Oh, something shifted in Ronan's expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect. He nodded once. "We'll work on it when we stop." The water turned out to be a spring-fed pool hidden in a narrow canyon, so clear Clara could see straight to the rocky bottom. The horses drank eagerly, while Ronan checked their surroundings with that same constant vigilance. "You can wash if you want," he said, gesturing to the pool. "I'll keep watch up there." He indicated an outcropping that overlooked their position. Clara looked at the water longingly. She was covered in 3 days of dirt, sweat, and the shame of the holding pen. But the thought of undressing, even partially, while Ronan was nearby made her hesitate. "I won't look," Ronan said, reading her expression. "And if anyone else comes, you'll hear me shoot them." He climbed up to his vantage point without waiting for her response, settling himself with his rifle across his knees and his back to the pool. Clara stood there for a moment, testing the offer, watching for any sign that he might turn around. When he remained motionless, focused on the landscape beyond, she made her decision. The water was shockingly cold, but felt like salvation. Clara stripped down to her undergarments and waded in up to her waist, gasping at the temperature, but grateful for it. She scrubbed at her skin, washing away Red Hollow and everything it represented, watching the dirt swirl away in the current. When she emerged, shivering and clean, she found that Ronan had left a spare shirt, his own, probably, draped over a rock near her clothes. It was too large but warm, and didn't smell like the holding pen. Clara pulled it on over her damp undergarments and felt something inside her chest loosen just slightly. Small kindnesses in a harsh world. They mattered more than gold. "Better?" Ronan asked when she climbed up to join him on the outcropping. "Much." Clara settled herself on a flat rock, grateful to be off the horse, even for a little while. "Thank you. For the shirt and for not looking." "Your body is your own. I have no right to it." He said it simply, like stating an obvious fact. "That town tried to take that right away. I won't make the same mistake." Clara studied his profile, the sharp angles of his face, the way he held himself with absolute stillness despite being constantly alert. "You really mean that, don't you? About getting me away from Red Hollow just to help." "I mean everything I say. I don't waste words on lies." "But why? You could have just ridden past. Let it happen. It wasn't your fight." Ronan was quiet for so long Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, like he was talking from somewhere far away. "I had a sister once, younger than me. She was bright. Too bright for the reservation they tried to keep us on. She learned to read English from a missionary, learned to write. She dreamed of being a teacher." Clara's breath caught. "What happened to her?" "Soldiers came through. There was a dispute over water rights and things got violent. They took her and 2 other girls as compensation. Called them spoils of war. His jaw tightened. By the time I found out where they'd taken them, it was too late. She'd hung herself in a supply tent rather than endure what they were doing to her. The words fell like stones into still water. Clara felt them sink into her chest, heavy and sharp. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back. Sorry doesn't change what happened. Ronan finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was old and deep and still bleeding. But when I heard about what Red Hollow was doing, about women being sold like cattle, I thought about Nalin. I thought about how no one helped her, how no one tried to stop it. I thought about what she might have become if someone had. So you saved me in her place. I gave you a choice. That's not the same as saving you. Isn't it? Ronan stood, ending the conversation with movement. We should ride. We've rested long enough. But as they climbed back down to the horses, Clara understood him better. Ronan Vale was a man built from grief and guilt, trying to atone for a loss that couldn't be undone. She was his second chance at something that had been taken from him years ago. The knowledge should have bothered her, being someone's redemption project, but somehow it didn't. At least his motives were clean. At least he was honest about what he wanted from her, nothing except to see her free. That was more than anyone else had offered in a very long time. They rode through the heat of midday and into the afternoon, the landscape growing increasingly alien. The canyons deepened, their walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, striped with bands of red, orange, and cream-colored stone that looked like frozen fire. The floor was sand and stone, dotted with hardy sage and the occasional twisted juniper that clung to life in impossible places. Clara found herself watching Ronan as they rode, noticing details she'd missed before. The way he read the land like a book, spotting water sources from the color of vegetation, identifying animal trails from subtle disturbances in the dirt, knowing which rocks would hold heat into the night and which would offer shade during the day. This wasn't learned knowledge. This was bone-deep understanding, the kind that came from being part of a place rather than just passing through it. You said you lived here before, Clara ventured during a brief stop to check the horses. How long? The first 16 years of my life. Then the soldiers came, and we were forced onto a reservation 300 miles north. Ronan ran his hand along his horse's flank, checking for injuries. I came back when I could. Been moving through this country for the last 10 years. Why not stay? Why keep moving? He gave her a look that suggested the question was naive. Because the moment I settle, someone decides I don't have the right to be there. Better to be a ghost. Ghosts are harder to hunt. That's no way to live. It's the only way I have. The simple acceptance in his voice made Clara's chest tighten. She thought about her own losses, her position as a teacher, her room above the general store, her belief in civilization and fairness. Those things had been stripped away in months. Ronan had been losing pieces of himself for years, maybe decades, and yet he kept moving forward. Tell me about the riding, Clara said, wanting to shift the conversation to something less painful. What am I doing wrong? Ronan's expression softened almost imperceptibly. For the next hour as they rode, he gave her a masterclass in horsemanship. How to sit deeper in the saddle, how to use her legs instead of her hands to direct the mare, how to read the animal's movements and work with them instead of against them. Feel her rhythm, Ronan said, bringing his horse alongside Clara's. She's not a machine, she's alive. When she moves, you move with her, like dancing. Clara tried to follow his instructions, adjusting her posture, relaxing her death grip on the reins. It felt awkward at first, vulnerable, like she might slide right off the saddle. But gradually, something clicked. The mare's movements became predictable, almost soothing. The constant jarring that had been making Clara's spine ache eased. Better, Ronan said, and Clara felt an absurd flush of pride at the simple praise. They made camp that night in a box canyon with a single narrow entrance that would be easy to defend. Ronan built another small fire, and they ate more jerky and hardtack. Clara's body hurt in new and interesting ways, but it was different from the morning. This was the pain of muscles being used, of strength being built, rather than the agony of weakness being exposed. Tomorrow will be harder, Ronan said, echoing his words from the morning. We start climbing. The path gets narrow, and if you slip, you fall a long way. Encouraging. It's not meant to be encouraging. It's meant to be honest. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. The canyon country protects its secrets. If you want to reach them, you have to prove you deserve to be there. And if I can't? If I'm not strong enough? Ronan looked at her across the flames, and his expression was serious but not unkind. Then I'll help you get strong enough. But you have to want it. I can't force you to survive, Clara. That choice has to be yours. The use of her first name surprised her. He'd been carefully formal until now. It created an intimacy that felt both dangerous and strangely comforting. I want to survive, Clara said quietly. I want to be more than what Red Hollow tried to make me. Then you will be. He said it with such certainty that Clara almost believed him. That night, lying on the hard ground with Ronan's borrowed shirt wrapped around her and the stars wheeling overhead, Clara thought about choices. She'd had so few of them in recent months. The fever had taken her students. The town had taken her freedom. The auction had tried to take her future. But out here in the wilderness, following an Apache warrior into canyon country that might kill her, Claire was beginning to understand that she still had the most important choice of all, the choice of who she would become next. She fell asleep thinking about that, about the possibility of transformation, about the person she might be on the other side of whatever was coming. The third day started before dawn. Ronan woke her with a gentle touch on her shoulder, which still made her jerk awake with her hand going for the hidden knife in her pocket. He stepped back immediately, hands visible, waiting for her to orient herself. Sorry, Clara mumbled, embarrassed by her reaction. Don't be. Fear keeps you alive. He handed her a cup of the terrible coffee. We need to move while it's still cool. The climbing will be hard. He hadn't been exaggerating. Within 2 hours, they'd left the canyon floor and started ascending a trail that barely deserved the name. It was little more than a crack in the rock face, winding upward in a series of switchbacks that made Clara's stomach lurch every time she looked down. The horses picked their way carefully, their hooves finding purchase on stone that looked too smooth to support them. Clara forced herself to trust her mare, to keep her eyes forward rather than on the drop that grew more terrifying with each step upward. Don't look down, Ronan called back. Look where you're going, not where you'll fall. Easy for him to say. His horse moved like it had done this 100 times before, confident and steady. But Clara gritted her teeth and tried to follow his advice, fixing her gaze on Ronan's back and refusing to acknowledge the void opening up beside her. They climbed for hours. The sun rose higher, turning the canyon walls into an oven. Sweat ran down Clara's spine, soaking into Ronan's borrowed shirt. Her hands ached from gripping the saddle horn, and her thighs burned from the constant tension of keeping herself balanced. Just when Clara thought she might actually scream from the strain, the trail widened and leveled out onto a mesa top. The relief was so intense she nearly wept. We'll rest here, Ronan said, dismounting with his usual grace. He came around to Clara's horse and held up a hand to help her down. Clara slid from the saddle and her knees buckled. Ronan caught her smoothly, one arm around her waist, holding her up until her legs remembered how to support her weight. Easy, he said quietly. Take your time. Clara became acutely aware of how close they were, of the strength in his arm, of the way he smelled like leather and sage and something wilder. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ronan stepped back, releasing her carefully, and the moment broke. You did well, he said, turning away to check on the horses. That's one of the hardest climbs in the canyon country. Most people can't do it on their first try. Clara wanted to tell him she'd been terrified, that she'd come within seconds of panic multiple times, that she still felt sick from the height. But his back was already turned, and somehow she knew he already understood all of that without her saying it. Instead, she walked to the edge of the mesa and looked out at the view that had almost killed her to reach. The canyon country spread out below and around them like a sea of stone, endless formations carved by wind and water into shapes that defied imagination. Colors shifted and changed in the sunlight, red to orange to purple to gold. In the distance, she could see a line of mountains, their peaks still touched with snow despite the desert heat. It was beautiful, savage and harsh and utterly beautiful. This is what I wanted you to see, Ronan said, coming to stand beside her. This is why the climb matters. The easy paths lead to easy destinations. But the hard paths, he gestured at the landscape before them, the hard paths lead here. Clara understood what he was saying, not just about geography, but about everything. The hard path she was on, the one that had led through fear and humiliation and exhaustion, it was leading somewhere that mattered. "How much farther?" she asked. "One more day. Maybe less if we don't run into trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Ronan's expression went cold. "The kind with guns and bad intentions." He was scanning the horizon again, that constant vigilance that Clara was beginning to recognize as his natural state. She followed his gaze but saw nothing except rock and sky. "You see something?" "Not yet, but they're coming." He said it with absolute certainty. "Sullivan won't wait long. He'll have gathered men by now, maybe a dozen. They'll be following our trail, and they'll be angry." "Can they track us through all this?" Clara gestured at the maze of canyons behind them. "Anyone can track us if they're determined enough. The question is whether they can do it fast enough to catch us before we reach safety." Ronan turned to her, his expression serious. "When they come, and they will come, I'll need you to follow my instructions exactly. No questions, no hesitation. Can you do that?" Clara thought about arguing, about insisting she deserved to know his plans, but she recognized the look in his eyes. This wasn't about control. This was about survival. "I can do that," she said. "Good." He moved back to the horses, beginning to redistribute the supplies on the saddlebags. "We're going to push hard today. No more breaks until dark. Can you handle it?" Every part of Clara's body screamed in protest at the idea, but she looked out at the canyon country, at the savage beauty of it, at the hard path that led to places worth reaching. "I can handle it," she said, and she meant it. They rode hard through the afternoon, pushing deeper into country that seemed to exist outside of time itself. The mesa top gave way to a narrow ridge that snaked between two massive canyon systems, and Clara found herself riding along paths where a single misstep would mean a fall of hundreds of feet. But something had changed in her since the morning climb. The fear was still there, coiled tight in her chest, but it no longer controlled her. She'd faced the height and survived it, and that small victory had planted something new inside her. Not quite confidence, but the seed of it. Ronan set a punishing pace, pausing only to let the horses catch their breath before moving on. He barely spoke, his attention divided between the trail ahead and frequent checks of their back trail. Clara watched him scan the horizon every few minutes, his hand never straying far from his rifle, and understood that his silence now was different from before. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of a man at ease. This was the tense silence of a predator sensing other predators nearby. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the canyon walls in shades of blood and fire, Ronan finally brought them to a halt in a sheltered depression where three massive boulders formed a natural windbreak. "We camp here," he said, his voice low. "No fire tonight." Clara slid from her horse, her legs shaking but holding. "They're close, aren't they?" "Close enough." Ronan was already unsaddling his horse with quick, efficient movements. "I spotted dust on the eastern trail about 2 hours back. Could be wind, could be riders." "You think it's them?" "I know it's them." He pulled his rifle from its scabbard and checked the action with practiced ease. "Sullivan's not stupid. He'd have started tracking us within hours of the auction. They've probably been pushing their horses harder than they should, trying to close the distance." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "How many?" "Can't tell from dust alone, but Sullivan wouldn't come with less than a dozen men." Ronan met her eyes across the dimming light. "They'll be tired from hard riding, angry and stupid with it. That makes them dangerous." "What do we do?" "We survive." He pulled out his saddlebags and extracted strips of dried meat and a canteen. "Eat, rest, and when I tell you to run, you run." Clara took the offered food but didn't bite into it immediately. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone." Something flickered in Ronan's expression, surprise, maybe, or concern. "You don't understand what's coming. These men won't hesitate to kill me, and what they'll do to you will be worse than death. If I tell you to run—" "I said I'm not leaving." Clara's voice came out harder than she intended. "You paid $500 to give me a choice. Well, I'm making one. I'm choosing to stand." Ronan stared at her for a long moment, and Clara could see him weighing options, calculating odds. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Then you need to know how to shoot." He retrieved a second rifle from his gear, smaller than his own, lighter, but still deadly serious. You ever fire one of these? My father taught me when I was young, hunting mostly. This isn't hunting. Ronan checked the rifle's mechanisms, then handed it to her carefully. This is war, and war has different rules. You don't aim for glory or honor. You aim to survive. He spent the next 20 minutes teaching her the weapon's peculiarities, how it pulled slightly left, how to compensate for the canyon wind, where to hold it to manage the recoil. His instructions were precise and clinical, stripped of everything except the information she'd need to stay alive. If it comes to shooting, Ronan said quietly, don't hesitate. Don't think about who these men are or whether they have families or whether killing them makes you a bad person. Out here, hesitation means death. Clara held the rifle in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the cold certainty of what it represented. She thought about the woman she'd been a week ago, the school teacher who'd believed in rules and civilization and the basic goodness of people. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different life entirely. I understand, she said. Ronan studied her face in the fading light, and whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. Get some rest. I'll keep watch. You haven't slept in 3 days. I've gone longer. He settled himself against one of the boulders with his rifle across his knees, his body already slipping into that state of alert stillness that seemed to be his natural condition. Sleep, Clara. You'll need your strength. Clara wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her like an undertow. She wrapped herself in a blanket from Ronan's supplies and lay down on the hard ground, using her saddle as a pillow. The stars were beginning to emerge overhead, scattered across the darkening sky like shards of broken glass. She must have fallen asleep despite her racing thoughts, because the next thing she knew, Ronan's hand was on her shoulder, gentle but insistent, and the world was still dark. They're here, he whispered. Clara came awake instantly, her heart hammering. She could hear it now, the distant sound of horses moving across stone, the low murmur of men's voices trying and failing to stay quiet. They sounded close, too close, maybe half a mile away at most. How many? Clara breathed. 14 that I've counted. Sullivan's leading them. I can hear his voice. Ronan's face was barely visible in the starlight, all sharp angles and shadows. They're making camp at the Box Canyon entrance, about a quarter-mile east. They think they've trapped us. Haven't they? Only if we stay here. Ronan began gathering their supplies with quick, silent efficiency. There's another way out, but it's dangerous. A narrow ledge along the canyon wall that leads to a system of caves. We can lose them there, but we have to move now before first light. Clara was already on her feet, her body protesting but obeying. The horses. We leave them. They'd never make it across the ledge, and the noise would give us away. Ronan pressed something into her hands, the rifle he'd taught her to use. Can you carry this and climb? Clara slung the rifle across her back the way she'd seen him do. I can do whatever I have to. Ronan's teeth flashed in what might have been a smile. Good. Follow exactly where I step. The ledge is maybe 2 feet wide in places, and the drop is about 300 feet. One mistake. I know. I fall a long way. Clara checked that the rifle was secure. I won't fall. They moved out into the darkness, leaving the horses tied with enough slack to eventually work themselves free. Clara felt a pang leaving the mare behind. The animal had carried her faithfully through all this. But Ronan was right. What was coming next required them to move like ghosts. The ledge appeared out of the darkness like a scar across the canyon wall. In daylight, Clara might have refused to attempt it. In the starlight, it was barely visible, just a lighter strip of rock against the darker cliff face. But Ronan stepped onto it without hesitation, his movements sure despite the darkness, and Clara forced herself to follow. The first few steps were the worst. Clara's every instinct screamed at her to press herself against the wall, to move slowly, to acknowledge the deadly drop just inches from her feet. But Ronan had taught her something in their days together, that fear could be acknowledged and then set aside, that the body could do remarkable things when the mind got out of its way. She focused on his back, on placing her feet exactly where he placed his, on breathing steadily despite the terror that wanted to claw its way up her throat. Behind them, the sounds of the camp grew fainter but didn't disappear. Men's voices carried in the still night air, rough with exhaustion and anger. That Apache bastard's got to be here somewhere, someone growled, and Clara recognized Sullivan's voice. Fan out at first light. Check every canyon, every cave. I want that woman back. What about him? Another voice asked. You really think we can take him in a straight fight? We don't fight fair, Sullivan said, and Clara could hear the ugly smile in his voice. We've got 14 guns to his 1. We catch him in the open, we cut him down. Simple as that. The voices faded as Clara and Ronan moved farther along the ledge. The pathway narrowed in places until Clara could feel the void pulling at her like a living thing, trying to drag her over the edge. Sweat ran down her spine despite the cold, and her hands shook so badly she had to pause and force them steady. Almost there, Ronan murmured, and then the ledge widened and they were stepping into the mouth of a cave. The relief was so intense Clara's knees buckled. She caught herself against the cave wall, breathing hard, her heart thundering in her ears. You did well, Ronan said quietly, and the simple praise meant more than it should have. The cave system was extensive, a labyrinth of passages that Ronan navigated with the confidence of someone who'd been here before. He produced a small stub of candle from his pack and lit it, shielding the flame carefully with his hand so it wouldn't be visible from outside. This connects to a series of passages that come out 3 canyons over, he explained, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The Apache used these caves for generations. Very few whites know they exist. You've been here before. Many times. When I was young, this was sacred ground. The elders would bring us here for ceremonies, for teaching. His face in the candlelight looked carved from stone, ancient and timeless. Now I use it to stay alive. They moved deeper into the earth, following passages that twisted and turned, sometimes opening into chambers vast enough to swallow the candlelight, sometimes narrowing until they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The air was cool and still, carrying the mineral smell of ancient stone and something else. Water, maybe, or the ghost of old smoke from fires long since extinguished. Clara lost all sense of time and direction. They could have been walking for 20 minutes or 2 hours. But finally, Ronan stopped in a chamber larger than the others, where the ceiling was high enough to be lost in darkness and the floor was relatively flat. We rest here, he said, setting down his pack. They won't find the cave entrance, and even if they do, these passages will confuse them. We're safe for now. Clara sank to the ground gratefully, every muscle screaming. The adrenaline that had carried her across the ledge was draining away, leaving her shaking and exhausted. How long do we stay? Until they give up and go home, or until we can circle back and continue to the hidden place. Ronan sat across from her, the candle between them casting strange shadows. Either way, we're trapped down here for at least a day, maybe 2. The reality of that settled over Clara like a weight. Trapped underground with a man she barely knew, while armed men hunted them above. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt an odd sense of calm, like the eye of a storm where everything was momentarily still. Tell me about the hidden place, she said. This place you're taking me to. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his face unreadable in the flickering light. It's an old Apache dwelling, built into the canyon wall. Most people couldn't find it even if they were standing right in front of it. There's water, shelter, and enough stored supplies to last through winter if needed. And you're just giving it to me? I'm giving you options. He leaned back against the cave wall. You can stay there as long as you need to figure out what comes next. Or you can use it as a base while you plan your next move. Whatever you choose, you'll be safe. What about you? I'll keep moving. I always do. Clara studied him across the candle flame, this strange man who'd bought her freedom and asked for nothing in return. Why do you live like this? Always running, always alone. Because it's safer than the alternative. Safer for who? Ronan's expression hardened. For everyone. I've learned that whenever I try to stay in one place, whenever I try to build something permanent, it gets destroyed. By soldiers or settlers or men like Sullivan who think they have the right to take whatever they want. Better to be a ghost. Ghosts can't be killed because they're already dead. That's not living, Claire said softly. That's just surviving. Surviving is enough. Is it? The question hung in the air between them. Ronan looked away, his jaw tight, and Clara knew she'd struck something raw. But before either of them could speak again, a sound echoed through the cave passages, distant but unmistakable. Voices. Men's voices, raised in discovery. "They found the cave entrance," Ronan said, his hand going immediately to his rifle. "Faster than I expected." "Can they follow us through the passages?" "If they're smart enough to mark their path and stupid enough to risk it." He stood, blowing out the candle and plunging them into absolute darkness. "We keep moving, stay close, and stay quiet." Clara reached out instinctively and found Ronan's hand. He squeezed once, reassurance, then started forward, pulling her gently along. In the darkness, Clara had no choice but to trust completely. Her free hand trailing along the cave wall while Ronan guided her through passages he seemed to know by memory alone. Behind them, the voices grew louder. Someone had brought torches, and Clara could see the flicker of firelight beginning to probe the darkness. The sounds echoed strangely in the confined space, making it impossible to tell exactly how close the men were. "There's tracks here," someone shouted. "Fresh ones." "They can't have gone far," Sullivan's voice boomed. "Spread out. Check every passage." Ronan pulled Clara into a side chamber, pressing them both against the wall. In the darkness, she could feel the tension in his body, coiled like a spring. His breath was steady despite the danger, and she tried to match her own breathing to his, tried to find that same deadly calm. Footsteps approached their hiding spot, accompanied by the bobbing light of a torch. Through a gap in the rock, Clara could see two men, one she recognized as Tom Brenner from the auction, the other a stranger. They were both armed with rifles, moving cautiously, clearly unnerved by the cave system. "I don't like this," the stranger muttered. "We could get lost down here. Die down here." "Sullivan says we search, Brenner replied, but he didn't sound happy about it either. "That Apache's got to be somewhere." They passed within 10 feet of where Clara and Ronan hid, so close Clara could smell the sweat and tobacco smoke on them. Her hand tightened on the rifle slung across her back, but Ronan's grip on her other hand stayed firm and steady. "Wait," that grip said. "Not yet." The men moved on, their torchlight fading into another passage, but Clara could hear more voices, more footsteps. Sullivan had sent multiple search parties into the cave system, and they were spreading through it like poison through veins. Ronan waited until the immediate threat had passed, then moved again, pulling Clara deeper into the labyrinth. But the cave system that had seemed so protective now felt like a trap. Every echo could be pursuit, every shadow could hide danger. And unlike Ronan, the searchers had light, which meant they could move faster, cover more ground. They emerged into another large chamber, and Clara felt a breath of fresh air touch her face. An opening somewhere, a connection to the outside world. But the relief was short-lived. From multiple passages around them came the sound of approaching men, their torchlight beginning to paint the chamber walls with flickering orange light. "They're boxing us in," Clara whispered. Ronan pulled her toward the source of the fresh air, a narrow crack in the cave wall, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "This leads outside, but it's a tight fit and a rough climb on the other side. Can you do it?" Clara looked at the crack, then back at the approaching torchlight. "Do I have a choice?" "There's always a choice, but some choices are better than others." Clara squeezed through the crack, feeling stone scrape against her shoulders and back. The rifle threatened to catch, and she had to twist awkwardly to get it through. Behind her, she could hear Ronan following, his larger frame having an even harder time with the narrow space. They emerged onto the canyon wall just as dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The beauty of it was almost obscene given their circumstances. Clara found herself on a narrow outcropping, maybe 4 feet wide, with a steep climb both above and below. "Up," Ronan said, already starting to climb. "There's an overhang about 60 feet up that'll give us cover and a defensive position." Clara started climbing, her hands finding holds in rock that had been worn smooth by centuries of wind and water. Her arms burned with fatigue, her fingers scraped and bleeding, but she kept moving because stopping meant falling or being caught, and both options were unacceptable. She'd just reached the overhang when she heard the shout from below. "There, on the cliff face!" Clara pulled herself up onto the overhang and immediately unslung the rifle. Below, men were pouring out of the crack in the cave wall, pointing up at them. Sullivan emerged last, his face twisted with rage and triumph. "Nowhere left to run, Apache," he shouted. "Come down peaceable and maybe I won't kill you too slow." Ronan didn't bother responding. He simply raised his rifle and fired. The shot echoed across the canyon, and one of Sullivan's men went down clutching his shoulder. "That's your warning shot," Ronan called down, working the rifle's action smoothly. "Next one's fatal. Leave now and live. Stay and die. Your choice." Sullivan's response was to raise his own rifle and fire. The bullet sparked off the rock inches from Clara's head, and suddenly the morning air was filled with the thunder of gunfire. Clara dropped flat on the overhang, her heart hammering. Bullets whined through the air, striking stone and sending chips flying. Ronan was firing methodically, his shots precise and measured, forcing the men below to take cover. "When I reload," Ronan said calmly, as if they were discussing the weather rather than fighting for their lives, "you fire. Aim for the biggest targets. Don't worry about killing, just keep them pinned down." Clara's hands shook as she brought the rifle to her shoulder. Below, Sullivan and his men were spread out along the base of the cliff, using rocks and the cave entrance for cover. It wasn't a good defensive position. Ronan had the high ground and better angles, but they had numbers and ammunition and probably assumed they could wait out a siege. Ronan's rifle clicked empty. "Now," he said. Clara pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, and she had no idea if she hit anything, but the men below scattered for better cover. She worked the rifle's action the way Ronan had taught her and fired again. Then again, not trying for precision, but simply keeping up the pressure while Ronan reloaded. "Good," Ronan said. "Keep shooting. Make them think twice about rushing us." The battle settled into a terrible rhythm. Ronan and Clara took turns firing while the other reloaded, keeping Sullivan's men pinned down, but unable to do much more than that. The sun climbed higher, turning the canyon into an oven, and still the standoff continued. Then Clara heard it, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She glanced at Ronan and saw his expression change, saw something that might have been fear cross his face for the first time. "Storm," he said, looking at the western sky. "Big one. Coming fast." Clara followed his gaze and saw it. A line of darkness swallowing the horizon, moving toward them with frightening speed. Lightning flickered in its depths, and even from this distance she could hear the wind beginning to howl. "We need shelter," Ronan said, scanning the cliff face. "The overhang won't be enough. That storm will wash us right off this wall." Below, Sullivan and his men had noticed the approaching storm too. Clara saw them conferring, saw the calculation happening, stay and fight, or run for better cover before the storm hit. Sullivan made his decision. "Fall back to the horses. We'll wait out the storm and finish this after." The men began retreating, some of them still firing to cover their withdrawal. Clara watched them go, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and dread. They'd survived the fight, but the storm coming toward them looked like it could kill just as efficiently as bullets. "There's a deeper cave system about 100 yards along this cliff," Ronan said, already moving. "But we have to get there before the storm hits. Can you keep climbing?" Clara looked at the storm, then at the cliff face stretching ahead of them. Every part of her body screamed for rest, for safety, for this nightmare to be over. But she thought about the woman who'd stood in line at the auction, bound and helpless, and about the woman she was becoming, one who climbed impossible heights and fired rifles at armed men and refused to quit, even when quitting would be so much easier. "I can keep climbing," she said. They moved along the cliff face as the storm bore down on them, racing against weather that didn't care about their survival. The wind hit first, nearly tearing Clara from the rock face, followed by the first fat drops of rain that made every handhold treacherously slick. Lightning split the sky close enough that Clara could smell the ozone, and thunder shook the very stone beneath her fingers. The cave entrance appeared out of the storm like salvation, a dark mouth in the cliff face, barely visible through the sheets of rain. Ronan reached it first, and immediately turned back to help Clara over the last few feet, his strong hand gripping her wrist and pulling her into shelter just as the full fury of the storm hit. They collapsed together on the cave floor, soaked and shaking, while outside the world turned into a chaos of wind and water and lightning that seemed determined to tear the canyons apart. And for the first time since this ordeal began, Clara started laughing. It came out half hysterical, edged with exhaustion and fear, and the sheer absurd impossibility of still being alive. Ronan looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "What's funny?" "Everything," Clara gasped between laughs. "Nothing, I was a school teacher a week ago. I taught spelling and arithmetic, and now I'm in a cave in a thunderstorm after a gunfight with 14 men, and I'm still alive, and I don't know whether to laugh or scream or—" She broke off as the laughter turned into something closer to sobs. All the fear and exhaustion and trauma of the past days crashed over her at once, and suddenly she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Ronan moved closer, not quite touching, but near enough that she could feel his warmth. "You're in shock," he said quietly. "It's normal after a fight. Let it happen." So Clara did. She let herself break apart there on the cave floor while the storm raged outside, let all the terror and grief pour out of her until she was empty and exhausted and strangely calm. When the storm finally passed, both outside and inside her, she found that Ronan had built a small fire near the cave entrance where the smoke could escape. He'd also laid out his bedroll and was methodically cleaning and reloading both rifles. "Better?" he asked without looking up. "Yes." Clara moved closer to the fire, craving its warmth. "Thank you for letting me—" "Survival isn't just physical," Ronan said, still focused on the rifles. "The mind breaks too if you don't let it. You needed to break a little. Now you can heal stronger." Clara watched him work, watched the careful precision of his movements, the way he seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and did it without hesitation or doubt. "Where did you learn that? About breaking and healing?" Ronan's hand stilled on the rifle. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, "From breaking. From healing. From doing it enough times that I learned to recognize the pattern." The firelight painted shadows across his scarred face, and Clara saw him clearly for maybe the first time. Not just the warrior or the rescuer or the ghost, but the man beneath all of that. A man who'd been broken so many times he'd become an expert in the process. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for everything that broke you. Don't be sorry, just survive." Ronan finally met her eyes across the fire. "That's the best revenge against the people who try to break us. We survive anyway. We heal anyway. We become stronger anyway." Outside, the storm had moved on, leaving the canyon country washed clean and gleaming. Inside the cave, something had shifted between them, a wall coming down, a truth acknowledged. They were both survivors, both carrying scars, both learning how to heal stronger in the broken places. And somewhere out there, Sullivan and his men were regrouping, planning their next move. But for this moment, in this cave with the fire warming them and their weapons cleaned and ready, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt ready. They stayed in the cave through the remainder of the day, taking turns keeping watch while the others slept. Clara discovered that exhaustion could overcome even fear, dragging her down into a sleep so deep she didn't dream at all. When she woke, the sun was low on the horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust, and Ronan was crouched at the cave entrance with his rifle, watching something in the distance. "They're still out there," he said without turning around. "Made camp about 2 miles south, near the water source. Smarter than I gave them credit for." Clara joined him at the entrance, careful to stay in the shadows. She could just make out a thin line of smoke rising from between 2 canyon ridges. "How many?" "Can't tell from here, but I'd guess most of them stayed. Sullivan's not the type to give up easy." Ronan's expression was grim. "He'll wait us out if he has to. Men like him, pride matters more than sense." "So what do we do?" "We don't give him what he's waiting for." Ronan turned to face her, and Clara saw that he'd been thinking, planning, calculating odds the way he seemed to do constantly. "There's a route that'll take us around their position, but it means traveling at night through some of the roughest country in the canyon lands. One wrong step and we fall. One loose rock and we give away our position." "But it gets us to the hidden place?" "If we survive it, yes." Clara looked out at the darkening canyon, at the maze of stone that could kill them as easily as Sullivan's bullets. A week ago, the thought of attempting such a journey would have been inconceivable. Now it felt like just another impossible thing to add to the growing list. "When do we leave?" Something that might have been approval flickered across Ronan's face. Full dark? Another hour, maybe less? Eat something now. We won't stop once we start moving. They ate in silence, sharing dried meat and the last of the hardtack, washing it down with water from a seep at the back of the cave. Clara found herself studying Ronan in the fading light, noticing details she'd been too exhausted or frightened to see before. The way his hands moved with absolute certainty, never wasting motion. The old scars that marked his arms and chest, visible where his shirt had torn during the climb. The careful way he rationed the supplies, making sure she ate more than he did, even though he was twice her size. "You're staring," Ronan said without looking up. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm trying to figure you out." "Not much to figure. I'm a man who's good at surviving and not much else." "I don't believe that." Now Ronan did look at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "What do you want to believe? That I'm some kind of hero?" "I'm not. I've killed men, Clara, more than you probably want to know about. I've stolen and lied and done things I'm not proud of, all in the name of staying alive. And yet you risked your life to save a stranger. One good deed doesn't balance the scale." "Maybe not," Clara said quietly. "But it counts for something." Ronan opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. He looked away, his jaw tight, and Clara realized she'd touched something raw again, some old wound that never quite healed. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Clara had learned that Ronan's silences were just another form of communication, that he said more in what he didn't say than most people managed with a flood of words. When full darkness finally fell, they prepared to move. Ronan distributed what little remained of their supplies between them, ensuring neither carried too much weight. He handed Clara one of the rifles along with ammunition, keeping the other for himself. "Stay within arm's reach," he instructed. "Watch where I put my feet and follow exactly. Don't look down, don't look back. Just keep moving forward." "What if I lose sight of you?" "You won't. I'll make sure of it." He paused, then reached out and squeezed her shoulder briefly. "You've proven yourself 10 times over, Clara. Trust that you can do this too." They slipped out of the cave into a night so dark it felt solid. The moon just a thin crescent that provided almost no light. The stars were brilliant overhead, but they offered little help in navigating the treacherous ground. Clara stayed close to Ronan, so close she could hear his breathing, feel the displacement of air when he moved. The route he'd chosen was a nightmare of loose scree and narrow ledges, winding through canyon systems that seemed designed to kill the unwary. Several times, Clara's foot slipped on loose rock, sending small avalanches cascading into darkness, and each time her heart stopped until she was certain the sound hadn't carried to Sullivan's camp. They'd been moving for perhaps 2 hours when Ronan suddenly froze, his hand shooting out to stop Clara. She stood absolutely still, hardly daring to breathe, while he listened to something she couldn't hear. "Someone's moving," he whispered, his lips close to her ear. "Southeast, maybe half a mile. Could be a patrol." Clara's hand tightened on her rifle. "Do we hide or keep moving?" "We move, but carefully. They're between us and where we need to go." Ronan's expression was grim even in the darkness. "Stay low and stay quiet." They continued forward, but now every step felt like it might trigger disaster. Clara's nerves were stretched so tight she jumped at every sound. The distant cry of a nightbird, the whisper of wind through stone, the skitter of loose pebbles under her feet. Then she heard it too. Voices, low and cautious, coming from somewhere ahead and to the right. Torchlight flickered between the canyon walls, revealing 2 men picking their way through the rocks. "Damn fool's errand," one of them muttered. "Searching these canyons in the dark, we're more likely to break our necks than find that Apache." "Sullivan's orders," the other replied. "Says that woman's worth more than all of us combined. Not just for himself, says there's men in Red Hollow who'd pay good money to see her brought back. For what? She's just a schoolteacher. For making a fool of them. For choosing a savage over civilized men." The voice held an ugly edge. "Sullivan says when we get her back, she'll learn what happens to women who don't know their place." Clara felt rage flood through her, hot and sudden, washing away fear. Her hand moved toward her rifle, but Ronan caught her wrist, his grip gentle but firm. He shook his head slowly, his meaning clear. "Not now. Not like this." The men passed within 30 yards of their hiding spot, So close Clara could see their faces in the torchlight, hard faces, cruel faces, the faces of men who'd convinced themselves that might made right. She watched them disappear into the darkness and felt something cold settle in her chest, something that had been building since the auction, but only now crystallized into perfect clarity. These men would never stop hunting her. Even if she made it to the hidden place, even if she stayed there for years, there would always be men like Sullivan who believed they had the right to own her, to punish her for daring to choose her own path. The world she'd grown up in, the one that had seemed so civilized and orderly, was built on a foundation of cruelty dressed up in Sunday clothes. "Clara," Ronan whispered, and she realized she'd been standing frozen, staring after the departed men. "We need to move." She nodded and followed him deeper into the canyon maze, but something had changed inside her. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by something harder, something that felt like steel being forged in fire. They walked through the remainder of the night, always moving, always alert. Twice more they spotted patrols, and each time they managed to slip past unseen. But Clara could feel the noose tightening. Sullivan had spread his men wide, creating a net that would be difficult to slip through once daylight came. Dawn found them on a high ridge overlooking a vast canyon system. In the growing light, Clara could see the hidden place for the first time, though calling it hidden seemed almost laughable, given how obvious it was once you knew where to look. Built into the canyon wall about halfway up was a series of structures, ancient and weathered, that seemed to grow organically from the rock itself. They were the color of the stone around them, crafted so skillfully that from a distance they simply disappeared. Just another variation in the canyon's texture. "The ancient ones built that," Ronan said quietly. "My people found it abandoned centuries ago and made it sacred. Now it's empty except for memories. It's beautiful. It's survival." Ronan scanned the approaches to the dwelling with a critical eye. "There's only one way up, a series of handholds carved into the cliff face. Easy to defend, impossible to attack without being seen. If we can reach it before Sullivan's men spot us, we'll be safe. And if we can't, then we make our stand in the open and hope we're better shots than they are." They started down from the ridge, moving as quickly as they dared. The sun climbed higher, burning away the cool of night and exposing them to anyone who might be watching. Clara's mouth was dry with thirst and fear, her body running on reserves she hadn't known she possessed. They were halfway across the canyon floor when she heard the shout. "There! On the west approach!" Clara's heart plummeted. She turned to see Sullivan and at least 8 men emerging from a side canyon, all of them armed, all of them running toward the ancient dwelling with clear intent to cut off their escape. "Run!" Ronan commanded, and they ran. It became a race across open ground, Clara and Ronan sprinting toward the cliff face while Sullivan's men closed in from the side. Bullets began kicking up dust around them, the crack of rifles echoing off the canyon walls. Clara ran harder than she'd ever run in her life, her lungs burning, her legs screaming, the rifle bouncing against her back. They reached the cliff face with maybe 100 yards to spare. Ronan practically threw Clara at the handholds carved into the stone. "Climb! Don't stop! Don't look back!" Clara started climbing, her hands finding the ancient grips, her feet scrabbling for purchase. Below, she could hear Ronan firing, the methodical crack of his rifle punctuating Sullivan's shouted orders. She climbed faster, driven by terror and determination in equal measure. Halfway up, she heard Ronan's rifle click empty. She glanced down, a mistake she'd told herself not to make, and saw him slinging the rifle across his back and starting to climb. Sullivan and his men had reached the base of the cliff and were firing upward, bullets sparking off the stone perilously close to Ronan's position. Clara reached the dwelling first, pulling herself over the edge into a stone courtyard that opened onto several rooms carved directly into the canyon wall. She immediately unslung her rifle and moved to the edge, taking up a position where she could fire down at Sullivan's men. The first shot felt like crossing a line she could never uncross. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and one of Sullivan's men went down, clutching his leg. She didn't let herself think about what she'd just done, just worked the action and fired again, keeping the men pinned down while Ronan climbed. He made it up just as Clara's rifle clicked empty. He rolled over the edge and immediately took her position, his own rifle already firing before he'd fully gained his feet. "Reload!" he shouted, and find something to block that entrance." Clara's hands shook as she fumbled with the ammunition, forcing bullets into the rifle's magazine while Ronan kept up a steady fire. When her rifle was loaded, she looked around desperately for something to use as a barricade. The ancient dwelling had been stripped of most portable items long ago, but there were still stone blocks, probably from collapsed walls, scattered around the courtyard. Clara grabbed one, it must have weighed 50 pounds, and dragged it toward the top of the hand-carved stairs. "They're trying to flank us," Ronan called out. "West side, through that side canyon." Clara dropped the stone block and ran to the western edge of the dwelling. Sure enough, she could see 3 men working their way up a parallel cliff face, trying to reach a position where they could fire down into the courtyard. She raised her rifle and fired, missing but forcing them to take cover. The battle settled into chaos. Sullivan's men attacked from multiple angles, trying to overwhelm through sheer numbers and firepower. But Ronan had been right about the defensibility of the position. The narrow approaches and high ground gave Clara and Ronan significant advantages, and they used them ruthlessly. Clara lost track of time. The world narrowed to the mechanics of survival. Load, aim, fire, reload, move to a new position, fire again. Her shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil. Her ears rang from the constant gunfire, and her throat was raw from breathing gun smoke and dust. Then Sullivan himself appeared at the base of the cliff, his face twisted with rage. "Enough of this," he roared. "That woman belongs to Red Hollow. We paid for her fair and square." "She belongs to herself," Clara shouted back, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I'm not property. I never was." "You don't get to make that choice." Sullivan started climbing, his rifle slung across his back, murder in his eyes. "You think you're better than us? You think running off with a savage makes you free? You're nothing but a whore who—" Ronan's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him half around. Sullivan grabbed at the handholds, but his wounded arm couldn't support his weight. For a moment he hung there, eyes wide with shock and the sudden understanding of mortality. Then his fingers slipped and he fell, tumbling backward to land with a sickening crunch on the rocks below. The silence that followed was deafening. Sullivan's men stared at their fallen leader, then at the ancient dwelling where Clara and Ronan stood with rifles raised, then at each other. "He's dead," someone said, voice hollow with shock. "We could still rush them," another man suggested half-heartedly. "You go ahead," Tom Brenner said, backing away from the cliff. "I didn't sign up to die over some woman. Sullivan's dead. Far as I'm concerned, that ends it." One by one, the men lowered their weapons. They gathered Sullivan's body with rough efficiency, loading it onto one of their horses, and then they simply left. No final threats, no promises of revenge. They just mounted up and rode back the way they'd come, leaving Clara and Ronan alone in the ancient dwelling with the smell of gun smoke and the weight of what they'd survived. Clara sat down hard on the stone floor, her rifle clattering beside her. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. She'd killed a man today, maybe more than one. She wasn't sure and was afraid to count. She'd stood her ground in a gunfight and survived, but the cost of that survival was written in blood on the canyon floor below. Ronan sat down beside her, close but not touching. Blood ran down his left arm from a grazing wound he hadn't mentioned during the fight. His face was pale beneath his bronze skin, lined with exhaustion and something that might have been sorrow. "You saved my life," Clara said quietly, "when Sullivan was climbing up. You could have let him come, let him kill me, and saved yourself the trouble. But you didn't. Told you before. Your life is your own." Ronan looked down at his bloodied hands. "I just helped you keep it. We helped each other." Clara reached out and took his hand, not caring about the blood or the impropriety or anything except the simple human need for connection after surviving something terrible. "I couldn't have done this without you." Ronan's fingers tightened around hers, and for a long moment they just sat there in the ancient courtyard, 2 survivors holding on to each other while the sun climbed higher and painted the canyon walls in shades of gold. Finally, Ronan stood, pulling Clara gently to her feet. "Come on, let me show you your new home." The dwelling was larger than it had appeared from outside, a series of interconnected rooms that extended deep into the canyon wall. Someone, probably Ronan himself, had stocked it with supplies over the years. There were blankets and dried food, canteens and ammunition, even a small cache of books that made Clara's heart ache with longing for her former life as a teacher. I've been using this place as a base for years, Ronan explained as he showed her around. Whenever I needed to disappear, I'd come here. It's safe, defensible, and completely off any map the government knows about. And you're just giving it to me. I'm giving you options. You can stay here as long as you need. There's a spring in the back chamber that never runs dry, and the stored food will last months if you're careful. Or you can rest here and then move on. Use it as a stepping stone to whatever comes next. Clara walked to the edge of the main room and looked out over the canyon. The view was staggering, miles of striated stone stretching to distant mountains, the sky vast and impossibly blue overhead. It was beautiful and harsh and utterly unforgiving, just like the journey that had brought her here. "What will you do?" she asked without turning around. "Keep moving. Same as always." "You could stay." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them wanted to examine too closely. Clara turned to face Ronan and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm not good at staying," he said quietly. "Every time I try, something goes wrong. People get hurt. It's better if I keep moving." "Better for who?" "For everyone. Especially you." Ronan looked away. "You've seen what happens when I'm around. Men with guns come looking. Blood gets spilled. You deserve better than a life of running and hiding." "What I deserve," Clara said, moving closer to him, "is the right to make my own choices. That's what you gave me, Ronan, not safety or security or some fairy tale ending. You gave me back the power to decide my own path." "And what are you deciding?" Clara looked at this man who'd bought her freedom with gold coins and defended it with bullets, who'd taught her to survive in a world that wanted her broken, who'd shown her that strength came not from never falling, but from getting back up every single time. She thought about the woman she'd been a week ago and the woman she was becoming, and she made her choice. "I'm deciding that you're wrong about staying," she said. "I'm deciding that some things are worth the risk. I'm deciding that I'd rather live one honest day than 1,000 safe lies." Something flickered in Ronan's eyes, hope or fear, or maybe both tangled together. "Clara, you told me my life is my own. Well, I'm choosing to share it with you if you'll stay, or alone if you won't. But either way, I'm choosing." Ronan stared at her for a long moment, and Clara could see the war happening behind his eyes, the pull between his instinct to protect her by leaving and his longing for something he'd thought was lost forever. Then, slowly, he reached up and cupped her face in his scarred, blood-stained hands. "You're sure?" His voice was rough with emotion he rarely let show. "I've never been more sure of anything." He kissed her then, gentle, despite the violence they'd just survived, careful despite the strength she knew he possessed. It tasted like dust and blood, and the promise of something new growing in hard soil. When they pulled apart, the sun was high overhead, burning away the last shadows from the courtyard. Below, the canyon stretched out in all its savage beauty, a land that would test them every single day they chose to survive in it. But Clara had learned something in the past week, something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The hard paths led to places worth reaching, and some things, some people, were worth every impossible step it took to get there. "We should tend to that wound," she said, nodding at his bloodied arm. Ronan smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and less haunted. "Always practical." "Someone has to be. You're too busy being dramatic." "Me? Dramatic?" "You shot a man off a cliff today and gave me a speech about ghosts. That's pretty dramatic." They laughed then, both of them, the sound echoing off the ancient walls and carrying out over the canyon. It was the laughter of people who'd survived impossible things and found each other on the other side, the kind of laughter that was half joy and half disbelief that they were still alive to make the sound. As Clara helped Ronan clean and bandage his wound, she thought about Red Hollow and the auction and the woman who'd stood in that line with bound hands. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different life entirely. She'd been broken apart by cruelty and rebuilt by survival, and the person who emerged from that forging was harder and stronger and utterly unbreakable. "Thank you," Clara said quietly as she tied off the bandage. "For what?" "For seeing me. For seeing who I could become when everyone else only saw what they wanted me to be." Ronan caught her hand, holding it against his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. "I only showed you the path. You walked it yourself." Night fell over the canyon country, bringing with it a cold that cut through the day's heat like a knife. Clara and Ronan built a fire in the dwelling's main chamber, the smoke escaping through ancient vents that had been designed for exactly that purpose. They ate better than they had in days, and Clara discovered that simple food tasted like a feast when you were finally, truly safe. As they sat by the fire, shoulders touching, watching the flames paint shadows on stone walls that had stood for centuries, Clara felt something settle inside her. Not peace exactly. The world was still harsh, still dangerous, still full of men who would take if given the chance. But she had found something rare and precious, the freedom to choose her own path and someone to walk it beside her. "Tell me about your sister," Clara said softly. "Nalin, tell me who she was." Ronan was quiet for so long Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly, he began to speak, his voice carrying old grief, but also something new, the willingness to share it, to let someone else help carry the weight. And Clara listened, there in the firelight, while outside the stars wheeled overhead, and the canyon kept its ancient watch, and she understood that this was how healing happened. Not all at once, not with grand gestures, but in small moments of trust and shared stories, and the simple choice to stay when leaving would be easier. They'd both been broken by a world that didn't value what they were. But here, in this place that existed outside that world's rules, they could build something different, something honest, something that belonged only to them. The days that followed Sullivan's death settled into a rhythm Clara had never experienced before. Not quite peace, but something close to it. The ancient dwelling became their world, a pocket of existence carved out of stone and defended by will. Each morning, she woke to find Ronan already up, checking their perimeter with that constant vigilance she'd come to recognize as love in its most practical form. Each evening, they sat by the fire and talked, slowly unraveling the stories that had made them who they were. Clara learned that Ronan's real name was something she couldn't quite pronounce, a name in a language that was slowly dying as its speakers disappeared. He'd taken the name Ronan Vale because it was easier for white men to say, easier to move through their world wearing their words like camouflage. But in the privacy of the dwelling, she called him by his true name, stumbling over the pronunciation until he gently corrected her, his hands guiding her mouth into the right shapes. "Better," he said one evening, a week after the battle. "You almost sound like one of the people." "Teach me more," Clara said. "Teach me your language." So he did, trading words for words, Apache for English, building a private vocabulary that belonged only to them. Clara discovered she had an ear for languages, that the same mind that had delighted in teaching children to read could absorb these new sounds and patterns. And Ronan proved to be a patient teacher, never mocking her mistakes, always encouraging her progress. But it wasn't all gentle lessons and quiet moments. The canyon country demanded constant attention, constant work. There was water to haul from the spring in the back chamber, food to prepare and ration, their defensive position to maintain. Clara's hands, once soft from a life of teaching, grew calloused from hauling stone and splitting wood. Her body, which had ached constantly those first days, grew strong and lean, adapting to the demands of this new life. Ronan taught her everything he knew about survival, how to read weather in the color of the sky and the behavior of birds, how to find water by watching where insects gathered at dawn, how to move through the canyon without leaving tracks, how to hide in plain sight, how to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder in it. "The land will take care of you if you learn to listen," he said one afternoon while they were gathering herbs from a hidden garden spot he'd cultivated over years. "Most people talk at it, demand from it. But if you listen, really listen, it'll tell you what you need to know." Clara knelt beside him, watching his hand select plants with absolute certainty. "How long did it take you to learn all this?" "A lifetime, and I'm still learning." He glanced at her with something that might have been amusement. "You're learning faster than I expected. You have good instincts. Years of managing 14 children taught me to notice things. Who's about to start crying, who's planning mischief, where the trouble will come from before it arrives. Same skills, different application." Ronan stood, his gathered herbs bundled carefully. "The canyon's not that different from a classroom. Both will test you. Both will teach you if you're willing to learn. They walked back to the dwelling in comfortable silence, and Clara found herself thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. The woman who'd stood in that auction line felt like someone from a story she'd heard rather than a life she'd lived. That woman had been broken, beaten down, stripped of agency and hope. But she'd contained within her the seeds of who Clara was becoming, someone who could stand in a gunfight and not flinch, who could climb impossible heights and survive impossible odds, who could look at a harsh land and see home. 2 weeks after the battle, Clara woke to find Ronan standing at the edge of the dwelling, staring out at the eastern horizon with an expression she'd learned to read as trouble. "What is it?" she asked, joining him. "Riders. 3 of them, maybe 4 miles out." His voice was calm, but his body was tense, ready for violence. Could be nothing. Could be more of Sullivan's men. Clara felt her stomach tighten, but the fear that washed through her was different now, sharper, cleaner, accompanied by a readiness that hadn't been there before. "What do we do?" "We watch, we wait, we prepare." Ronan moved back into the dwelling and began checking their weapons with methodical efficiency. Could be they're just passing through. The canyon's remote, but not unknown. Prospectors sometimes come through looking for gold or silver. They spent the morning watching the riders approach, tracking their progress through the canyon system. Clara had learned enough about reading the land to see what Ronan saw. The riders weren't moving like men who were lost or prospecting. They moved with purpose, following a specific route, and that route was taking them directly toward the ancient dwelling. "They know where we are," Clara said quietly. "They know where something is." Ronan lowered the field glasses he'd been using. Could be they're tracking Sullivan's men, trying to find out what happened. Or could be someone in Red Hollow sent them specifically. "Should we run?" Ronan looked at her, and Clara saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, a kind of tired resignation. "I'm done running, Clara. This place is defensible. We're well supplied, and we've proven we can hold it. If they come with violence, we'll meet it. If they come with something else..." He shrugged. "We'll see." By noon, the riders had reached the canyon floor below the dwelling. There were 4 of them, and Clara felt relief flood through her when she saw they weren't Sullivan's men. These riders looked different, older, more weathered, moving with the careful respect of people who knew this land and understood its dangers. One of them, a man with silver-gray hair and the bearing of someone used to command, reined his horse to a halt and looked up at the dwelling. His eyes found Clara and Ronan immediately, as if he'd known exactly where to look. "I'm looking for Ronan Vale," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I mean no harm, just want to talk." Ronan stepped forward to the edge, his rifle held loosely but ready. "You found him. State your business." "Name's Marcus Webb. I'm a federal marshal out of Denver." The man held up his hands, showing he wasn't holding a weapon. "I heard about what happened in Red Hollow, came to ask some questions." Clara felt ice form in her stomach. A federal marshal. That could mean arrest, trial, hanging. She started to step back, to retreat into the dwelling, but Ronan's hand caught her arm. "Stand your ground," he murmured. "Running now admits guilt." "I'm not alone," Webb continued. "I've got Deputy Sheriff Anderson here along with 2 witnesses from Red Hollow, women who were at that auction. They've got some things to say if you're willing to listen." Ronan was silent for a long moment, weighing options, calculating risk. Finally, he called back. "You can come up, just you and 1 other. The rest stay down there where I can see them. And Marshal, if this is a trick, it'll be the last one you ever pull." Webb nodded slowly. "Fair enough. I'm bringing Miss Porter with me. She's one of the women from the auction. Says she has something important to tell you." Clara watched as Webb and a young woman, Elizabeth Porter, the 17-year-old girl who'd been sold to that old man, began the climb up to the dwelling. It took them 20 minutes, and by the time they reached the top, both were breathing hard and treating Ronan and Clara with visible wariness. Elizabeth's eyes found Clara first, and something complicated passed across her face. Relief, shame, hope. "Miss Whitmore," she said quietly, "I'm glad you're alive." "Miss Porter." Clara studied the girl, noting the bruises that were fading on her wrists, the haunted look in her eyes. "What happened to you?" "What happens to all women in Red Hollow who don't have power or protection?" Elizabeth's voice was flat, drained of emotion. But that's changing now. That's why we're here. Marshal Webb cleared his throat. May we sit? This is going to take some explaining. They settled in the dwelling's main chamber, an uneasy circle around the cold fire pit. Webb pulled out a notebook, but he didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at Clara and Ronan with an expression that was hard to read. First thing you need to know, Webb said, is that you're not under arrest. Neither of you. What happened with Sullivan? That was self-defense, and I've got 8 men willing to testify to it. They rode back to Red Hollow telling everyone who'd listened that Sullivan was trying to murder an unarmed woman and got shot for his trouble. Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. And the auction? What we did to escape it? That's more complicated. Webb finally opened his notebook. That auction was illegal 6 ways from Sunday. Territory law is clear. You can't sell people, not even under the fiction of a bride lottery. But proving it happened is harder when the whole town was complicit. Not the whole town, Elizabeth said quietly. Some of us had no choice, and some of us are ready to speak up now that Sullivan's gone. Miss Porter here has testified that she was forced into that auction under threat of violence, Webb explained. So have 3 other women. They're prepared to testify that Mayor Hutchins orchestrated the whole thing, that he pocketed most of the money, and that several men in Red Hollow knew it was illegal but participated anyway. So arrest them, Ronan said flatly. Already did. Hutchins is sitting in a cell in Denver right now, along with 2 of his associates. The town council that approved the auction has been dissolved, and we've got a territorial judge coming in to sort out the mess. Webb looked at Clara. But I need your testimony, Miss Whitmore. You were the only woman who fought back publicly. Your words carry weight. Clara felt Ronan tense beside her, but she kept her eyes on the marshal. What happens if I testify? You help put some very bad men in prison. You help ensure this never happens again, not in Red Hollow or anywhere else in the territory. Webb leaned forward. And you get your name cleared. Right now there are warrants out for your arrest on those fake debt charges. I can make those disappear, but only if you cooperate. And what about him? Clara nodded at Ronan. What happens to the Apache who dared to challenge white men's authority? Webb's expression shifted, and Clara saw something like respect flicker across his face. Mr. Vale acted within his rights. He participated in a legal transaction, even if that transaction was itself illegal, which is a funny bit of legal logic, but there it is. He paid the asking price, and when Sullivan came after him with murderous intent, he defended himself. That's not a crime. In theory, Ronan said quietly. In practice, Apache men get hanged for less. You're not wrong, Webb admitted, but I'm not here to perpetuate injustice. I'm here to stop it. And right now, stopping it means making sure people like Hutchins face consequences, and people like you 2 don't. Clara looked at Ronan, trying to read his expression. She could see the conflict there, the lifetime of experience telling him that white men's law never protected people who looked like him, warring with the possibility that maybe, this once, things could be different. I need to think about it, Clara said finally. Fair enough. You've got 3 days. Webb stood, gesturing for Elizabeth to follow. After that, the judge arrives and we start the trial, with or without you. But it'll mean more with your voice in it. As they started back toward the dwelling's edge, Elizabeth turned back. Miss Whitmore, I need to thank you. What you did at that town meeting, standing up and calling it what it was, that gave some of us the courage to speak up too. You started something important. I didn't start anything, Clara said. I just refused to pretend cruelty was civilization. Same thing, Elizabeth replied with a small, sad smile. Then she and the marshal were gone, climbing back down to where their companions waited. Clara and Ronan stood at the edge and watched them ride away, disappearing back into the maze of canyons. When they were finally alone again, Clara turned to find Ronan watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You're going to testify, he said. Not a question. I think I have to. Why? We're safe here. We have everything we need. Going back there, putting yourself in front of judges and lawyers and men who still think they own the world. It's a risk. It's the right thing to do. Clara moved closer to him, taking his hands in hers. You told me once that survival was enough, but you were wrong.
Survival is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We have to do more than just survive. We have to fight to make the world different for the people who come after us.
That's a dangerous way to think. Living is dangerous. Loving is dangerous. Choosing to be more than what the world wants to make you.
That's the most dangerous thing of all.
Clara squeezed his hands.
But we've proven we can handle dangerous.
Ronan studied her face for a long moment, then pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers.
If you testify, I'm going with you.
I'm not letting you face that alone.
They might arrest you anyway.
Despite what Webb said, there are people who won't accept an Apache man defending himself against whites.
Let them try.
There was steel in Ronan's voice, the sound of a man who'd been running for too long and was finally ready to stand.
I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending I don't have the same rights as anyone else. If you're going to fight, then I'm fighting beside you.
They spent the next 3 days preparing, not just for the journey back to civilization, but for what would come after. They couldn't stay in the ancient dwelling forever. Winter was coming, and while the place was defensible, it was also isolated in ways that would become deadly when the snows came.
We need a plan, Clara said on the second evening, while they were sorting through supplies,
for after the trial, assuming things go well.
That's optimistic. I'm choosing to be optimistic.
Clara set down the bundle of dried herbs she'd been organizing.
We've survived everything else. We can survive this too.
Ronan leaned back against the wall, studying her in the firelight.
What do you want, Clara?
If you could have anything, build any life, what would it look like?
Clara thought about it, really thought about it.
A week ago, she might have said she wanted her old life back, the classroom, the students, the simple respectability of teaching. But that woman's dreams felt small now, constrained by expectations she hadn't even known she was living under.
I want land, she said slowly, the answer surprising her even as she spoke it.
Not much, just enough to build a home.
Somewhere between the settlements and the wild places, where we can be ourselves without having to explain or justify or hide. I want to teach again, but differently. Not just reading and writing, but survival skills, self-defense, how to be strong in a world that wants women weak. That's a radical vision.
Good.
The world needs more radical visions. Clara met his eyes. What about you? What do you want?
Ronan was quiet for a long time, his expression distant.
I want to stop running. I want to build something that lasts. I want... He paused, then continued quietly. I want what my sister never got to have. A life lived on my own terms, with someone I choose, in a place that feels like home.
Then that's what we'll build, Clara said simply. After the trial, after all this is settled, we'll find that land and we'll build that life.
You make it sound easy.
I make it sound possible. There's a difference. On the morning of the third day, they packed what they needed for the journey: weapons, supplies, and the small collection of documents that proved Clara's identity and Ronan's legal purchase at the auction. Then they climbed down from the ancient dwelling and began the long ride toward Denver. The journey took 4 days. They moved carefully, avoiding settlements where possible, camping in the open under stars that felt different now, less like distant lights and more like witnesses to their transformation. Clara noticed how much she'd changed in just these few weeks. She no longer rode like a farm girl who'd forgotten her skills. She rode like someone who belonged in the saddle, reading the land, anticipating danger, moving with confidence. "You've become dangerous," Ronan observed one evening while they made camp. "The way you sit that horse, the way you scan for threats. You move like a warrior now."
Is that a compliment?
It's an observation, and yes, a compliment. He smiled slightly. The woman I bought at that auction could barely stay in the saddle. Now you ride like you were born to it. People change when they're given the chance to become who they really are. They reached Denver on a clear morning, the city sprawling across the high plains like something from another world. Claire had been to cities before, but after weeks in the canyon country, the noise and crowds and smell of civilization felt overwhelming. She stayed close to Ronan, noticing how people stared at them, at him specifically, their eyes tracking the Apache man riding through their streets with open suspicion. Marshal Webb met them outside the courthouse, looking relieved. "I was starting to worry you wouldn't come. The trial starts tomorrow morning." "We're here," Clara said. "What do we need to do?" What followed was a blur of legal preparation. Webb introduced them to a lawyer named Sarah Brennan, no relation to Tom, who was one of the few women practicing law in the territory. She was sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, and she listened to Clara's story with an intensity that never wavered. "This is going to be ugly," Sarah warned when Clara had finished. "Hutchins has hired the best defense lawyer in Denver, and he's going to try to paint you as a troublemaker who brought this on herself. They'll question your morals, your choices, your right to refuse what they'll call a legitimate economic transaction." "Let them," Clara said quietly. "I know what happened. I know what they tried to do, and I'm not afraid to say it." The trial began the next morning in a packed courtroom. Clara took the stand wearing a dress Sarah had provided. Respectable, modest, designed to remind the jury that she was a school teacher, a civilized woman, not some wild creature who'd run off with a savage. But Clara felt the lie in the costume, felt the way it tried to constrain her back into the shape of who she'd been. Still, she played the part, because sometimes you had to work within the system to change it. Hutchins' lawyer was exactly as bad as Sarah had warned. He questioned everything: Clara's debts, her teaching record, her decision to speak out at the town meeting, her choice to go with Ronan instead of one of the respectable men who'd bid on her. "Isn't it true, Miss Whitmore," the lawyer said with false sympathy, "that you could have prevented all of this by simply accepting the town's solution to your financial troubles?" Clara looked at the jury. 12 men, mostly middle-aged, some looking uncomfortable, others openly hostile. She thought about telling them what they wanted to hear, about playing the victim who'd made mistakes and learned her lesson. But that woman no longer existed. "No," she said clearly, "because the solution you're describing was slavery. It was the commodification of human beings, and I will never accept that as legitimate, legal, or moral, regardless of what debts I supposedly owed." The lawyer sputtered, trying to regain control. "But the law is what we make it," Clara interrupted. "And if the law says that women can be sold like cattle because men with power decide they should be, then the law is wrong and needs to be changed." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel, but Clara could see she'd struck something. Even the hostile jurors were shifting uncomfortably now, perhaps recognizing the implications of what they were being asked to condone. When Elizabeth Porter took the stand and described in quiet, devastating detail what had been done to her after the auction, how the man who'd bought her had treated her as property in every sense, how she'd been denied even basic human dignity, several jurors looked away in shame. When 3 more women testified to similar experiences, the mood in the courtroom shifted. This wasn't an abstract legal question anymore. This was about real people, real suffering, real injustice. The defense tried to call character witnesses for Hutchins, men who testified to his standing in the community, his years of service as mayor. But Sarah Brennan tore them apart on cross-examination, revealing that most of them had profited from the auction in one way or another. The trial lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony and arguments and legal maneuvering. Through it all, Clara watched Ronan sitting in the back of the courtroom, his face impassive but his eyes never leaving her. His presence anchored her, reminded her why this mattered. On the evening of the 3rd day, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Hutchins' lawyer shouted objections while Hutchins himself sat pale and shaking. The women who'd testified clutched each other and wept with relief. And Clara felt something inside her chest loosen, a weight she'd been carrying since that terrible auction finally beginning to lift. The judge sentenced Hutchins to 10 years in federal prison. His associates got 5 years each. And then the judge did something unexpected. He issued a ruling that the bride lottery had been illegal from its conception, that all transactions stemming from it were void, and that any women who'd been sold were legally free of whatever arrangements had been made. Furthermore, the judge said, his voice carrying across the stunned courtroom, let it be known that this court will not tolerate such practices in this territory. Human beings cannot be bought or sold, regardless of their gender or circumstances. Any future attempts to create such systems will be met with the full force of territorial law. It wasn't everything. It didn't undo the trauma or erase the memories or bring back the innocence that had been stolen. But it was something. It was a line drawn, a statement that some cruelties would not be tolerated.
Outside the courthouse, Clara found herself surrounded by the women from Red Hollow. They thanked her, some of them crying, others just gripping her hands with silent gratitude. Elizabeth Porter hugged her fiercely. "You gave us our voices back," Elizabeth whispered. "Thank you." Clara hugged her back, feeling the girl's fragile strength, and thought about how survival took so many forms. "What will you do now?" "I don't know, but I'll figure it out. We all will." Elizabeth stepped back, managing a shaky smile. "Maybe we'll take a page from your book. Find some hard path that leads somewhere worth going." That evening, Clara and Ronan sat in a hotel room that felt simultaneously too soft and too confining after weeks in the canyon. Through the window, they could see Denver spreading out below them, all lamps and noise and human complication. "You did it," Ronan said quietly. "You stood up to them and won." "We did it," Clara corrected. "I couldn't have gotten here without you." "What now?" Clara thought about the question, about the future stretching out before them like unmarked territory. "Now we find that land we talked about. We build that life. We become the people we've been trying to be. It won't be easy. Nothing worth having is." Clara moved to stand beside him at the window. "But I'd rather have one hard, honest day with you than a lifetime of easy lies with anyone else." Ronan turned to her, and in his eyes, Clara saw everything they'd survived together. The auction and the chase, the gunfight and the storm, the moment in the cave when they'd both chosen to stop running. She saw the future too, uncertain and probably difficult, but theirs to build however they chose. "I love you," he said simply. "I didn't think I'd ever say those words to anyone. But I love you, Clara Whitmore, for your strength and your courage and your absolute refusal to be anything less than who you are." "I love you too," Clara replied, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. Ronan Vale, ghost who became real, warrior who chose peace, the man who bought my freedom and taught me I'd always had it. They left Denver 2 days later after signing papers that cleared Clara's name and established Ronan's legal standing in the territory. Sarah Brennan had helped them navigate the bureaucracy, and before they left, she'd pressed a document into Clara's hands. "Land grant," Sarah explained. "The territory owes you for your testimony, and I made sure they paid in property. It's not much, just 160 acres about 30 miles west of here, but it's yours, free and clear. Good water, decent soil, and remote enough that people will leave you alone if you want them to." Clara stared at the document, hardly daring to believe it. "This is what you earned," Sarah said firmly. "Now go build something beautiful on it. And if anyone gives you trouble, legal trouble, you send for me. We women have to stick together." The land, when they finally reached it, was everything Sarah had promised and more. It sat in a valley between two ridges, protected from the worst of the wind, with a stream running through it that never ran dry. The soil was good, the grass was thick, and in the distance they could see the mountains rising like promises against the sky. "What do you think?" Clara asked, standing in the middle of what would become their property. Ronan turned in a slow circle, reading the land with eyes that had learned to see what others missed. "It's defensible. Good water. The hunting will be decent in those hills. And it's far enough from town that we won't have neighbors unless we want them. So we claim it?" "We already did." Ronan pulled her close, and Clara leaned into his warmth. "This is home now. We'll build it together." They spent the first month living in a tent while they worked on a more permanent structure. Clara had thought the physical labor of the canyon country had been hard, but building a home from scratch was an entirely different challenge. They cut and hauled timber from the surrounding forest, shaped logs and fitted them together, built walls that would keep out the winter cold and the summer heat. Ronan worked with the quiet efficiency she'd come to associate with him, never wasting effort, always thinking 3 steps ahead. But Clara surprised them both with her own capabilities. The strength she'd built in the canyon served her well here, and the teaching instinct that had made her good in the classroom translated easily to learning new skills. "You're a natural builder," Ronan observed one evening while they were notching logs for the walls. "I'm a natural learner," Clara corrected. "There's a difference. You're teaching me, and I'm paying attention. Same thing I said about you in writing. Maybe we're both just good at recognizing each other's strengths." The house took shape slowly but surely.
It was simple. 2 rooms and a loft, with a stone fireplace that Ronan built with rocks from the stream, but it was solid and well made, and most importantly, it was theirs. Every log they placed, every stone they fitted, was a statement of permanence, of their refusal to keep running. As winter approached, they made their final preparations. Clara used some of the money Ronan had saved over the years to order books and teaching supplies from Denver. If she was going to teach again, she'd do it her way. Practical skills mixed with traditional learning, survival wisdom alongside literature and mathematics. "You really think people will bring their children to learn from you?" Ronan asked one evening while they were building shelves for the books. "I think some will. The ones who understand that the world is changing, that the old ways aren't working anymore." Clara ran her hand along the smooth wood. "And if they don't, that's fine too. We'll teach whoever comes to us, even if it's just each other." The first snow came in late November, blanketing their valley in white silence. Clara stood at the window of their completed home and watched it fall, feeling something she'd almost forgotten existed: contentment. Not happiness exactly, not the uncomplicated joy of someone who'd never suffered, but the deeper satisfaction of someone who'd been broken and rebuilt themselves stronger. "You're smiling," Ronan said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I was just thinking about how far we've come, about the woman I was at that auction and who I am now." "Who are you now?" Clara thought about it, really considered the question. "I'm someone who knows that strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid and moving forward anyway. I'm someone who's learned that the hard paths lead to places worth reaching. I'm someone who chose her own life and fought to keep it." "You're Clara Whitmore," Ronan said softly. "Teacher, survivor, warrior, home. And you're Ronan Vale, ghost who became real, the man who saved me by teaching me I could save myself." They stood together in the window, watching the snow transform their valley into something clean and new, and Clara understood that this was what victory looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but the quiet accumulation of days lived honestly, choices made with full awareness, love given and received without conditions. The winter passed in a rhythm of work and rest, planning and building. They used the time to refine their skills, to strengthen their home, to prepare for whatever would come next. Clara taught Ronan to read and write English with greater fluency, while he continued teaching her the language and ways of his people. They became fluent in each other, learning to communicate as much through silence as through words. When spring finally came, melting the snow and turning the valley green, Clara opened her school. She didn't advertise, didn't make grand proclamations. She simply put up a small sign at the crossroads 5 miles away: "Whitmore School, all welcome." The first student arrived on a warm afternoon in April. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, brought by her mother who looked both hopeful and nervous. "I heard you teach differently," the mother said, "that you teach girls more than just reading and sewing." "I teach survival," Clara said simply. "Reading and mathematics and literature, yes, but also how to ride, how to defend yourself, how to be strong in a world that will try to make you weak. Is that what you want for your daughter?" The mother looked at her daughter, then back at Clara. "Yes, that's exactly what I want." More students came, not many at first, just a handful of children whose parents were brave enough or desperate enough to try something different. Clara taught them in the main room of the house, with Ronan sometimes joining to teach tracking or survival skills, or the history of people who'd lived in this land long before the settlers came. The children learned quickly, and more importantly, they learned to be strong. Clara taught the girls that their voices mattered, that their bodies were their own, that they had the right to choose their own paths. She taught the boys that strength meant protecting rather than dominating. The true courage was standing up for what was right even when it was hard. "You're building something revolutionary," Ronan said one evening while they watched the last student ride away with her father. "I'm building what should have always existed," Clara replied. "A place where children learn to be fully human, not just whatever narrow role society has decided they should fill." As summer approached, word of the school spread. Some people came out of curiosity, wanting to see the woman who'd stood up to Red Hollow and won. Others came because they recognized that something new was being built here, something that might point toward a different kind of future. One afternoon, a familiar figure rode up to the house. Elizabeth Porter, looking older than her years, but stronger too, accompanied by two other young women. "Miss Whitmore," Elizabeth said, dismounting with new confidence, "we heard about your school. We were wondering, do you only teach children?" Clara smiled. "I teach anyone willing to learn. What did you have in mind?" "We want to learn what you learned, how to be strong, how to survive, how to build lives that belong to us." Elizabeth glanced at her companions. "There are more of us in Red Hollow, women from the auction and others who saw what happened and decided they wanted something different. We thought maybe you could teach us." Clara looked at Ronan, who nodded slightly. Then she turned back to Elizabeth. "How long can you stay?" "As long as it takes." They built a second structure that summer, a bunkhouse where the women could stay while they learned. Elizabeth and her companions were just the first. Others came, women from towns throughout the territory who'd heard about a place where you could learn to be more than what society expected. Clara taught them everything she knew: how to ride and shoot, how to read the land and survive in it, how to stand up for themselves without apologizing. But she also taught them literature and mathematics, history and philosophy, because strength came in many forms, and education was one of the most powerful. Ronan taught them tracking and wilderness survival, treating the women with the same respect and high expectations he'd shown Clara. He taught them that survival wasn't just about physical skills, it was about mental toughness, about refusing to quit even when everything seemed impossible. "You're like the older brother we all wished we had," one of the women told him during a particularly grueling tracking lesson. "Someone who expects us to be strong instead of protecting us from being strong." "Strength can't be given," Ronan replied. "Only discovered. I'm just helping you find what was already there." 2 years passed. The school grew slowly but steadily, its reputation spreading through quiet word of mouth. Clara and Ronan's home became a refuge for women who wanted something different, a place where old rules didn't apply and new ones could be forged. They faced challenges, of course. Some men in the nearby towns objected to what Clara was teaching, claiming she was corrupting young women with dangerous ideas. There were threats, both subtle and overt, and twice they had visitors who came looking for trouble. Both times they found more than they bargained for. Clara and her students had learned Ronan's lessons well, and they defended their home with a combination of skill and absolute determination that sent the troublemakers running. "You've built an army," Ronan observed after the second incident, watching Clara's students practice with rifles in the yard. "I've built a community," Clara corrected. "Women who know their worth and won't let anyone take it from them. That's more powerful than any army." On a warm evening in their third year on the land, Clara and Ronan sat on the porch of their home and watched the sunset over the valley they'd claimed. The bunkhouse was full of students, their voices carrying on the evening air as they talked and laughed and planned their futures. The school had become more than either of them had imagined, not just a place of learning, but a beacon for anyone who believed that people deserved the right to define their own lives. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked quietly. "Buying me at that auction? Everything that came after?" Ronan took her hand, his scarred fingers intertwining with hers. "Every hard thing I've ever done led me to you. How could I regret the path that brought me home?" "Is that what I am? Home?" "You're everything." He pulled her close, and Clara leaned into his warmth, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "You're the reason I stopped running. You're the proof that broken things can heal stronger. You're the future I didn't think I deserved." Clara thought about the woman she'd been, standing in that auction line with bound hands and dead eyes. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, through fear and exhaustion, through gunfights and storms, through every impossible thing that had tried to break her. And she thought about who she'd become on the other side of it all. "We did it," she said softly. "We built something that matters, something that will outlast us. We did it together." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, watching the light fade from their valley and the lamps kindle in the bunkhouse. Somewhere inside, Elizabeth was teaching the newer students a song in Apache that Ronan had taught her. The sound of it drifted on the evening air, a blend of old and new, a bridge between worlds that had too long been separated. Clara understood then that this was the true victory, not the trial or the land grant or even their survival. The victory was in this moment, this building of something new from the broken pieces of what had been. It was in the women who came to learn and left stronger. It was in the children who learned that strength and compassion weren't opposites, but complements. It was in the simple fact that they'd refused to let cruelty define them, had chosen instead to let love and determination forge them into something better. "I have something for you," Ronan said, pulling a small bundle from his pocket. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a necklace made from turquoise and silver, crafted in the traditional style of his people. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed. "It belonged to Nalin, my sister." Ronan's voice was quiet but steady. "I've carried it for years, couldn't bear to part with it. But I think she'd want you to have it. You're living the life she never got to live, free and strong and choosing your own path. You're honoring her memory just by being who you are." Clara felt tears sting her eyes as Ronan fastened the necklace around her throat. The weight of it settled against her skin, a tangible connection to the sister who'd been lost, whose absence had driven Ronan to save a stranger and in doing so, save himself. "I'll honor her," Clara promised. "Every day, with every choice I make, I'll honor her." They sat together as night fell fully, wrapped in each other and in the knowledge that they'd carved out something rare and precious from hard stone and harder circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did. But they'd face those challenges together, two survivors who'd learned that strength wasn't about never falling, but about getting back up every single time. In the distance, a coyote called, and Ronan answered it with a sound that was half human, half wild, a reminder that some things couldn't be fully tamed and shouldn't be. Clara listened to the sound echo across their valley and smiled. They'd been broken by a world that saw them as less than fully human, but they'd rebuilt themselves into something stronger, something that couldn't be defined by others' narrow categories. They were survivors, yes, but more than that, they were free. And in the end, freedom was worth every impossible step it took to claim it.